Hi, everyone. I want to quickly go over some of these slides on the Romantic era, specifically focusing on the history and political writing of the time. So when we're thinking about Romanticism in literature, we can see that our textbook that we're using is defining this period as starting with the preface or starting with the publishing of the lyrical ballads and then ending with the deaths of Shelley and Byron. It's just kind of interesting to see that they're framing it that way, basically saying that Coleridge and Wordsworth started this movement and that Shelley and Byron ended it by their deaths. We can see how poets are so central to this time period, right? And if we look at the preface to the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth wrote about how poets have this ability to capture emotion, to share that emotion, and this idea is that you feel these really intense emotions in a moment, and then you kind of think about it, and you wait until you get calmer, and then once you're calm and you've really taken the time to think about it, you write a beautiful poem that really captures those emotions that you felt and creates that in the reader. There's this idea at the time that poets are just so wise that they're kind of prophets, and that they're capable of channeling the emotions and beliefs of kind of simpler people, which we'll get to that in a second. It's kind of offensive, right? And be able to express that in like some beautiful, deep way. Okay. Speaking of simpler people, so what I wanted to say here is that basically we're going to see this theme throughout this reverence of the natural world. We're going to see beautiful, poems about landscapes, Mont Blanc, like all these beautiful places and times. The Romantic people, these writers, they really liked the natural world. There's kind of this pushback against industrialization. They've seen the way that greed and industrialization have corrupted the land, have corrupted people. And so they have this idea that there's people who are uncorrupted, right? And these are going to be children, women, and agricultural workers. And so there's obviously something problematic here, right? When they're talking about people being simpler than them. Um, but the idea here is that that these are the people who have been uncorrupted by this industrialization, right? And so they are closer to nature. They have a wisdom. So on the one hand, these poets are trying to elevate these people, but I think we can obviously see, with 2024 eyes, how this is not a great look. And so, yeah, you're going to see this throughout. You're going to see landscapes described. You're going to see childhood described, and just kind of keep in mind what they're talking about is like purity, goodness. And a lot of the time they're going to be using this to contrast with evil, for example. We're going to see those kinds of themes come up when we're looking at our Gothic, supernatural, and exotic themes in surrealism. And so basically, there was just a lot of value put on emotions, right? We're responding to the objectivity valued by the previous era, and people want to feel things, right? We want to make people feel things through our poetry, through our writing, and so we're going to see this in the Gothic and other these themes at the time. And you'll see that a lot of this is probably influenced by the way that we're having new scientific discoveries come in that are really challenging the way that we think about things as maybe created by God, and that have been taught to us all of our lives about how the church and the universe works and how God has organized everything. And now we have this whole idea of like science and how, we're related to all these other animals and how we've all evolved. And it's just like very challenging to the way that people thought before, right? And so we have Darwin coming out at this time, Origins of Species. We're going to have Frankenstein, right? That's going to be really, I think, responding to this in a way where it's like God versus man, or man versus God versus nature. And there's just kind of this like battle going on with like, where are we going with all of this new knowledge? We also see this coming up with the way that people talk about exotic subjects. For example, if we're looking at something like Kubla Khan by Coleridge, if we're looking even at this week, Mary Wollstonecraft, she talks about, and I can't think of the word that she uses, but it's a word that starts with an M, has Muhammad's name in it, referring to Muslims. And what she's saying is she has this idea about how Muslims believe that women don't have souls. That is not true, but it's something that English people knew enough to know what Islam was, to have some sort of ideas about Muslims, but they didn't actually know enough about Muslims to know what is true and not. And so she had this idea that was like widely believed. She writes about it. And the way that she's using this idea is to contrast Muslims who believe women who don't have souls with the good English people who know women have souls and really should be fighting for their rights. And so we can see why that's problematic, I hope. But we're going to see this used a lot in the time period. They're being exposed to different cultures as British Empire is taking over most of the world. And so they're going to be fascinated by these differences, these new people, these new places, these new cultures that they're learning about. They're going to incorporate them into their writing. And a lot of times it's going to show us the fear that they were feeling at the time, as well as that fascination. Okay. One of the other themes that is important to think about is liberty and feeling. And basically, when we're looking at this era, we can see how they're responding so strongly to the previous era, which was so obsessed with objectivity, that was so obsessed with decorum, good manners, that really loved monarchy and great leaders, ordained by God. And we're moving away from that now. We like individualism and subjectivity. We like freedom and human rights, and we want expression and emotion and feeling. That's where the romantics are coming in, right? They don't like this old stuff, this old-fashioned stuff. They want something new, and they're really pressing against it. Okay, so I want to kind of move on now to talk about the political writing. And so the important thing to keep in mind is that at this time period, we have the American and the French revolutions happening. And so that's just going to majorly influence these people, right? Because the American Revolution is, of course, a former English colony, or America is. And so, that's them. And then France is just so freaking close. So both of these cultures are going to have major influences on the British. And that's going to really show up in the writings that we're going to read this semester, especially in this time period. Okay. Of course, before there's going to be government censorship, and then people won't write about it anymore, and it won't be cool anymore anyway. The first writer that we're looking at this week is Mary Prince. I don't know if you've read any slave narratives. This is one of the first written by a Black woman. And so basically what slave narratives were doing is they're a way of fighting the fight for anti-slavery, abolition. And so, we see that there's going to be, and I talk about this in the next slide, we see that there's going to be people like Anna Letitia Barbauld, who's going to write poetry, and she has like this like really beautiful language that she's using in verse form. And I don't think, she's important enough to be remembered. Her poems are still included in our textbook. For example, Charlotte Smith is another person. But these are white British women, middle class or upper class even. I think both of them are middle class, but we'll see later upper class women doing this too, who are kind of fighting for human rights. And it's obviously, it's a good cause. But it just has so much more emotional impact when we see someone who's actually experienced this sharing their story. And we have a quote here. I have been a slave myself. I know what slaves feel. This is slavery. I tell it to let English people know the truth. And so just kind of keep in mind, she's sharing this story with us and with the English people in this time period because slavery was still legal. It wasn't legal in England, and you weren't allowed to trade enslaved people anymore, but you were allowed to keep using slave labor in the West Indies, for example, which is where Mary Prince is from. And so she was sold into slavery. She was sold multiple times to different people. She was broken up from her family. She was taken away from her husband, which we see in this selection of her story that was assigned this week. It's just really different to hear it from someone who's actually gone through it, right? And so I think that this is one of the most powerful texts of this era. She really had a major influence on abolition, which would eventually become the rule, right, would become the law. And it was shortly after this was published. Another person that we're going to talk about this week is Robert Burns. He's writing in Scots dialect. And so basically what we're seeing here, or Scots language. So what we're seeing here is he's, if it's kind of hard to read, if you kind of have to like say it out loud, that's pretty common. That's it's something that it's just not going to be like the English that we'll read from other writers because it is different, right? And he's doing that intentionally as well. One of the things that we're going to see from Burns is that he has he's very a lot of pride in Scotland, right? When we read this first poem, he's talking about Robert Bruce and William Wallace, I believe. um, both of these are people who were Scottish army leaders. And so the idea here is that they fought against English invasion. England is now, at this time, Scotland is part of Great Britain. But this is a little bit of a pushback against that, right? He is clearly interested in Scottish sovereignty, something that we see come up a lot. Even as recently as 2022, this was part of our discussion. This has been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And a lot of Scottish people would like to not be occupied, would not like to be part of Great Britain anymore in this British Empire. And so we can see that here with Burns. And one of the things that's interesting about Burns is that he's using this form, this verse form, or what he's doing is he's making songs. And what they would do is they would sing them. And this first poem here is actually like a kind of a national anthem, or was, of Scotland. And one of the ideas here is that he's using songs which are transmitted orally, right? To kind of get past censorship, because if you're writing this down in an essay or, in some sort of like a poem that's easy to read and understand, the references are really obvious, then, maybe he's going to get censored and in trouble. And he was able to be just sneaky enough to get by while people really knew what he was doing, right? Okay. I included some keywords here for poetry. I don't know how familiar you are with reading poetry, but it's really helpful to kind of know how to refer to things like a stanza, which is basically like, the paragraph of poetry. We're grouping together lines. He's going to use quatrains, ballad stanzas, iambic, which, well, I can show you how that works, but basically you just want to, if you can listen to the song, you'll hear it. It's like da 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 da. It's the second syllable is where you're having that emphasis, instead of the first syllable. And so you can hear that. And then the rhyme scheme, of course, we have, I don't know if you've seen rhyme schemes written out, but we're going to use letters to show where the rhymes are. And this is going to be referring to the last word in the sentence or in the line. Okay. Finally, we're reading A Vindication of the Rights of Women this week by Mary Wollstonecraft. This is one of the first feminist texts that we think of, the earliest written text. And basically what she's arguing is that women need to be better educated, so that they can be better at running households, at raising children, and it's going to make England stronger. Um, so again, we can see, like I said, she has some kind of problematic way of comparing, for example, English Christians to Muslims, who don't believe women have souls. But we can also see other kinds of ideas going on here. She's critical of upper class women, who she says are like the most frivolous. She's really addressing middle class women who, at least have some sense, right? She is talking about biological differences of sexes, which we can see kind of like a scientific influence, I think, on her way of thinking there, when she's talking about, well, they're just biologically bigger than women. And it's like, that seems to be pretty specific to that time period when they're starting to talk like that. In terms of science, criticism of, desire for freedom. Again, we're having this human rights, this revolutionary thinking influencing our writing. And so this is something that we'll see here. She's not a perfect person. I think we can see how she's a little dated in some of her viewpoints, even some of these that I'm just listing. But I think that we can see how she has been so influential even to contemporary feminism. One thing that I wanted to point out here, just in case this is something that you might have missed, she talks about how she's trying to use common language. She wants to make sure that her words are coming across in an authentic way. She says this quote here: "I shall disdain to cull my phrases or polish my style. I aim at being useful. Sincerity will render me unaffected." And at the end here, she says, "I shall not waste my time in, dazzling with my language." which is from artificial feelings, which coming from the head never reach the heart. So again, we can see how even in her, pretty logical argument about why women deserve this kind of education and different rights, she's still really trying to get a feeling out of her readers, right? And so we can still see influences of the time, just some of the things I wanted to point out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you have a great week, and I hope this was helpful.